This is the story of Ethan Marcus Calloway and his wife Claire Renee Calloway. They had built something that most people would call a good life, a house, with a garden neither of them tended anymore. Dinner conversations that ran out of things to say somewhere around year 4, and a marriage that functioned the way old furniture does, present familiar, quietly deteriorating. Ethan loved Claire in the way that long-term love often manifests, not as a flame but as an assumption, a background hum so constant he'd stopped hearing it. Claire, for her part, had begun to mistake being known for being seen, and the difference between those two things had grown into something she couldn't name, but desperately felt. What would unravel them wasn't a single act of betrayal, so much as the accumulated weight of 100 small withdrawals from conversation, from curiosity, from each other. This is a story about ego dressed as love, attention mistaken for intimacy, and two people who forgot to look at each other until it was too late to unsee what they found. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something almost domestic when Ethan came downstairs that Tuesday morning. Claire was already at the counter, phone face down beside her mug, scrolling through something on the tablet, a recipe she'd said once when he'd asked. He hadn't asked again. "There's coffee," she said, without looking up. "I see it." This was how most mornings started, not badly exactly, but without warmth. They had learned to coexist in the space between closeness and distance, occupying the same rooms the way planets share a solar system, near enough to feel each other's gravity, far enough never to collide. Ethan poured his coffee and stood at the window overlooking the yard. The bird feeder Claire had hung 2 springs ago was empty. He noticed this the way he noticed many things about their life, lately cataloging small neglects without knowing what to do with the inventory. They had been married 9 years, together for 11, long enough to have inside jokes that had stopped being funny, long enough to know each other's habits, like muscle memory, and lately long enough to feel the absence of certain things more acutely than the presence of others. It wasn't that they fought. That would have required energy neither of them seemed to have. What they did instead was maintain. They maintained a clean house. They maintained polite conversation. They maintained the performance of a marriage for the benefit of friends, family, and whoever might be watching, including themselves. Ethan was a structural engineer, which perhaps explained his tendency to assess load-bearing elements, to ask, quietly and privately, what was holding things up and what might eventually give way. Claire worked in corporate communications at a mid-sized tech company called Aldrin Systems, a job she'd taken 3 years ago after leaving a nonprofit she'd loved but that hadn't loved her finances back. She was good at her job in the way efficient people often are, methodical, articulate, skilled at shaping narratives. He had noticed the texting in the way one notices a change in weather, not the moment it shifts, but in retrospect. It had started, he thought, around February. The way her phone had begun to feel like a third presence at dinner. The way she'd angle the screen slightly away when he passed behind her on the couch. None of it was dramatic. None of it announced itself. It was more like the way a room changes temperature. You don't feel the precise moment it becomes cold. "Big day today?" he asked, sitting across from her at the table. Claire looked up. "Quarterly review prep. Daniel wants everything organized before Thursday." Daniel. He'd heard the name before, a coworker, she'd explained. "Project manager. Funny in that dry way that workplaces produce," she'd said once, laughing at something on her phone. Ethan had smiled and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. "Sounds tedious," he offered. "It is." She smiled briefly, the kind of smile that closed as fast as it opened. Her phone buzzed against the table. She flicked it over, read something, and typed a response before setting it back down. The whole exchange lasted maybe 8 seconds. She didn't explain it. Ethan drank his coffee. There was a version of himself that would have asked. That version felt like a younger man, someone who still believed that asking questions was an act of love rather than an act of exposure. The Ethan who sat at this table now had learned, over years, that certain doors were better approached slowly. He wasn't sure yet if this was wisdom or cowardice, and he suspected it might be both. "I'll be late tonight," Claire said, standing to rinse her mug. "Team dinner after the prep session." "Okay," Don't wait up. She said it lightly, practically, not cruelly, and that was the thing. It was never cruel. It was always practical, reasonable, the kind of language that made suspicion feel paranoid and silence feel like sanity. He watched her gather her bag, check her reflection in the hallway mirror for exactly 3 seconds, and leave. The door closed with a soft, definitive click. Ethan sat with his coffee until it went cold. Then he got up, rinsed his own mug, and stood at the window again. The bird feeder was still empty. He thought with the methodical clarity of a man who measures weight for a living that something in this house had been redistributed, that some load was sitting now where it hadn't before. He couldn't tell yet if the structure would hold. By March, Ethan had begun to understand the specific geometry of being lied to by omission. It wasn't that Claire said things that were false. She said things that were true but incomplete, the verbal equivalent of a photograph, cropped just enough to change the story. She mentioned Daniel the way you mention the weather, casually, without weight, as if his name were simply part of the landscape of her days. And yet his name appeared with a frequency that Ethan had begun, privately, to map. He was not a dramatic man. He had never swept things off tables or raised his voice past a certain controlled pitch. He processed inward the way certain soils absorb water slowly, thoroughly, showing nothing on the surface until the saturation point was reached. He hadn't reached it yet. He was monitoring. One evening in mid-March, Claire came home animated in a way he hadn't seen in months. Not happy, exactly, more like lit up. She set her bag down and started talking before she'd even taken off her coat, something about a campaign pitch that had gone better than expected, a last-minute restructure that had impressed the senior team. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway watching her. Daniel actually defended the whole third section when Marcus started picking it apart, she said, pulling off her coat. He didn't have to do that. It was my section. That was decent of him, Ethan said. It was more than decent. He knew exactly what to say. She paused, and something moved across her face, brief and unguarded, before she picked up her phone and carried it with her down the hallway. Ethan turned back to the stove. He stirred something that didn't need stirring. He was not jealous in the conventional sense. What he felt was more architectural than emotional, a structural awareness that something was load-bearing that shouldn't be. That weight was being transferred in ways the original design hadn't accounted for. The feeling wasn't hot. It was cold and precise. 2 weeks later, he saw a message by accident. Claire had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and it lit up with a notification. Not enough to read the full message, but enough to see the name and the first fragment. Daniel, I keep thinking about what you said. The phone went dark before the rest of it. Ethan stood there for a moment. Then he refilled his water glass and went to the living room. He didn't pick up her phone. He didn't check it. He had made a decision somewhere in the accumulated quiet of recent months that his approach would not be confrontation, not because he lacked courage, but because he had learned that confrontation without evidence was just accusation, and accusation without strategy was just pain with nowhere to go. He wanted to understand the full structure before he touched anything load-bearing. That night, they watched television on the couch, a documentary about deep ocean geography that neither of them had chosen with any enthusiasm. Claire sat with her legs tucked under her, phone balanced on her knee. Ethan sat at the other end, close enough to be normal, far enough to notice. Do you ever feel like we've just gotten used to each other? He said during a lull between segments. Claire glanced over. What do you mean? I mean. He considered how to phrase it, like we know the shape of each other so well that we've stopped looking, like we've memorized each other without understanding. She was quiet for a moment. That's a strange thing to say. I know. Where's this coming from? Nowhere specific. He looked at the television, great dark trenches, miles of silent water, creatures that had evolved to live without light. I've just been thinking. She looked at him for a second longer than usual, and in that second he saw something. Not guilt, not exactly, but a kind of recognition. She was being reached, and she knew it, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. I think that happens to everyone, she said finally. In long relationships. You settle. Settle, he repeated. That's not a bad word. He nodded slowly. No, he said. I suppose not. Claire turned back to the documentary. Her fingers moved to her phone, then stopped. She left it on her knee untouched for the next 11 minutes. Ethan counted. Not because he was keeping score, but because stillness, in her, had become a kind of language. He was learning to read it. Later, in the kitchen, refilling his glass while Claire stayed on the couch, Ethan leaned against the counter in the dark and looked at the ceiling. And then, in a way he couldn't entirely explain, in the way exhausted people sometimes speak aloud to no one, he said quietly, to the room, to the silence, to whatever empty space a man speaks into when he is too tired to keep everything inside. I don't know, maybe like this story, or subscribe or something. He blinked, felt the strangeness of it, wasn't sure where it had come from. From the living room, Claire called. What? Nothing, he said, talking to myself. A pause. Okay, she said. He stood there another moment, the refrigerator humming beside him, the television murmuring from the other room, and the particular loneliness of a man in his own kitchen pressing down around him like water. He had started, quietly, to form a plan. He found Rebecca Hartwell's professional profile on a company directory listing Daniel Hartwell, Senior Project Manager, Aldrin Systems. Was easy enough to locate, and a small amount of additional searching surfaced Rebecca, a landscape architect, a LinkedIn photo taken at some kind of outdoor conference, auburn-haired and composed in the way of someone who had learned composure through effort rather than birth. Ethan spent 3 evenings constructing the letters. He was careful not to invent. That was the rule he set for himself. No fabrication, no exaggeration. He worked only from what he had, fragments he'd glimpsed, inflections he'd catalogued, the particular way Claire said Daniel's name, the animation that entered her face when she recounted his small acts of attention. He wrote in a tone that was neither accusatory nor cruel, more like evidence arranged quietly for someone else to interpret. He signed them simply as a friend who thought you should know and mailed them to Rebecca's studio address, which was listed publicly on her firm's website. He sent 3 letters over 3 weeks. Then he waited. What he had not anticipated, what he had perhaps underestimated, in his careful structural way, was that Rebecca Hartwell was already aware. She responded not to him directly, but through action. She called Claire's office and introduced herself as the wife of Daniel Hartwell, saying only that she hoped they could speak sometime, that she'd heard a great deal about Claire from her husband. She said it pleasantly, professionally, in the same register one uses to schedule a dentist appointment. She had been told later, secondhand, that Claire had said very little after that call, that she had closed her office door and sat quietly for some time. The confrontation with Claire, when it came, was not a confrontation in any theatrical sense. It happened on a Sunday morning, with coffee, the way the most important conversations often do. Rebecca Hartwell called you at work, Ethan said. It was not a question. He watched her face register a cascade of things: surprise, calculation, fear, and beneath those, something more complicated. How do you know that? Does it matter? Claire wrapped both hands around her mug. It wasn't what you think. You don't know what I think. Ethan, I'm not angry, he said. And he was surprised to find this was partially true. I've had a long time to get used to knowing something I wasn't ready to name. I'm mostly... He paused, looking for the precise word. Tired. Nothing happened, she said. Not the way you're making it sound. I'm not making it sound like anything. I'm telling you his wife called you at work. Claire looked at the table. We were close. Closer than I should have let it get. But I didn't. It wasn't physical. I know. She looked up, surprised. I know what it was, he said. That almost makes it worse. She was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street. Why didn't you just ask me? She said finally. Her voice had changed, softened, not strategically, but genuinely. Because I already knew, and because... He stopped. Because I wanted to see how long it would go. What you would choose if the choice became necessary. That's not fair. No, he agreed. A lot of things aren't, She started to say something he could see her forming it, the kind of sentence that begins with I and contains the word feel, but she stopped herself. Something in his stillness, his complete absence of anger, seemed to have taken the usual scaffolding away. I was lonely, she said at last, quietly. The words seemed to cost her something. I know, Ethan said. So was I. They sat with that for a while. It was the most honest thing they'd said to each other in perhaps 2 years. And it fell into the space between them, not as a beginning, but as a kind of final accounting. The corporate event was Claire's idea, originally. The quarterly showcase a company-wide affair at a downtown hotel. Clients and partners and senior leadership gathered in a room full of ambient lighting and catered ambition had been on the calendar for months. Claire had organized a significant portion of it. She did not know going in that Rebecca would be there, or that Rebecca and Ethan had spoken, once, briefly, on the phone, a conversation neither of them planned, that had happened the week after the Sunday morning with coffee, when Rebecca called the number from which the letters had eventually, cautiously, been traced back. They did not conspire in any cinematic sense. What passed between them was more restrained. Two people who had separately arrived at the same understanding, who recognized in each other the particular exhaustion of people who had been quietly certain for a long time. At the event, in the third hour, Daniel introduced his wife to his colleagues with the proprietary ease of a man who kept different parts of his life in separate rooms. Claire was standing 6 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water, when she saw them together. She saw Rebecca's hand on Daniel's arm. She saw, for the first time, the woman fully not as a background figure in a story she told herself about two people who understood each other, but as a real and present person with her own intelligence and her own patience and her own calendar of quietly collected evidence. Rebecca looked at Claire once, not with anger, with something clearer than anger, a kind of calm acknowledgement that said simply, I see you, and I've seen you for some time. Then Daniel spoke to someone else, and the moment passed. Claire spent the rest of the evening in a register of controlled normalcy that cost her more than she'd expected. It was not the public exposure she'd feared. There were no scenes, no whispered revelations. It was something more internal and more precise. The moment she understood that Daniel did not look for her once, the rest of the evening, in a way that suggested the slightest worry about what she might be feeling. He circulated. He networked. He put his hand on the small of his wife's back for a photograph. The story Claire had told herself that she and Daniel shared something real and rare, something that transcended the ordinary arrangements of their lives, developed a structural fault in that hotel ballroom that no amount of revision could repair. She drove home alone. Ethan had not attended. In the weeks that followed, she moved through her days with a surface that she maintained well. She had always been good at surfaces. She told a close friend that she and Ethan were going through a quiet period, which was true in the way that the ocean floor is a quiet place. She told herself that she hadn't really lost anything she'd had to begin with, that the loneliness she'd felt in her marriage had been real, and the connection she'd sought had been understandable, if imperfect. What she didn't tell anyone was how often, in those weeks, she replayed Daniel's face at the event. The ease of him, the completeness, the way he had moved through the room without once appearing to be missing something. She began to understand, not a secret he was protecting, but a story he was managing. Ethan, for his part, had moved into the second bedroom without announcement or ceremony. He was quiet about it, as he was quiet about most things, transferring a few books, a lamp, a phone charger, in the same methodical way he approached any reorganization of space. He was not bitter, exactly. He was completing an assessment he had been running for a long time and following it to its logical conclusion. He called his sister for the first time in months. They talked for 2 hours. He did not discuss Claire directly. He talked about the yard, about a project at work, about whether he'd ever wanted to travel more than he had. His sister listened and at the end said carefully, "Are you okay?" "I think I'm getting there," he said, and was surprised again to find it true. 6 months later, on a Thursday in early autumn, Claire found Ethan in the yard. He had, sometime in the preceding weeks, finally refilled the bird feeder. She noticed this before she noticed him. the flash of a sparrow leaving the perch as the back door opened, and something about that particular detail arrived in her chest before she was ready for it. He was pulling the last of the summer growth from the edges of the beds, working with the unhurried focus of someone whose mind was elsewhere in a peaceful way. She stood on the step for a moment before he looked up. "I didn't hear you come out," he said. "I didn't want to interrupt." He sat back on his heels and looked at the yard. It had improved. There was no other word for it. He had spent several weekends out here quietly reordering things. And the evidence was in the straightened beds and the turned soil and the bird feeder that swayed slightly in the October air. "The lawyers sent the revised paperwork," she said. "I saw." He looked at her. "Did you have changes?" "No." She paused. "It's fair." He nodded. She stepped off the porch and came to stand a few feet from where he was kneeling, close enough to speak at a normal volume without raising her voice. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said that morning, about being used to each other." He waited. "I think," she stopped. Tried again. "I think I confused being unseen with being trapped, and I think I looked for a door that wasn't really a door." Ethan was quiet for a moment. A sparrow returned to the feeder. They both watched it without commenting. "I think that's probably right," he said. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. This isn't that. I just wanted to say it. Out loud. To you specifically. I know." She looked at the yard, at what he had done to it in small increments over months. Without ceremony, without an audience. "You refilled it," she said, nodding at the feeder. "September," he said. "Got tired of looking at it empty." Claire nodded slowly. There was something she wanted to say. She could feel the shape of it, the way you feel an unformed word on the back of the tongue. But when she searched for it, what she found instead was the understanding that some things are not sayable, not because language fails, but because the moment for them has already passed, quietly and without announcement, the way most important things do. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She went back inside. He stayed in the garden until the light changed, which took another hour. The afternoon doing what October afternoons do, pulling warmth slowly from the air and leaving something clear and cool and irreversible in its place. He was not happy, exactly. He was not unhappy. He was in the particular condition of a person who has finished assessing a structure that couldn't be saved and has already begun thinking about what to build next carefully, this time, with better materials, with more attention to the foundations, with the hard-won knowledge that what looks stable and what is stable are not always the same thing. The sparrow stayed on the feeder a long time. He let it.